We are back, and we are joined now by Dr. Mark Paul, Assistant Professor of Economics at Rutgers University, author of The Ends of Freedom, Recovering America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Great to be here with y'all.
So, I mean this as a compliment. Your book does not necessarily read like you are an economist.
Thank you.
Yeah, it centers around this call for an economic bill of rights. But most economists I found treat like economics as this science, as something fairly distinct from society, and your book makes it makes the opposite pitch essentially. And it's about what it means to truly be free and to truly have rights in America. Just I guess talk a little bit about the fact that you're an economics professor, and this is not necessarily the typical book that your field kind of produces.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to kick off this conversation. Let me start with how I got into economics, because I don't know about you, but like when you ask your average 5-year-old what they want to do when they get older, they might want to be a nurse or a teacher or a doctor. I wanted to run an aquarium. That was always my dream. Didn't quite shake out. But coming out of high school, I actually went to culinary school, and I worked in kitchens all through high school. And that's what initially got me interested in economics. It was working in the back of the house in restaurants, largely on the line with immigrants who had been working their ass off 50, 60 hours a week, every single week for a year in and year out. And maybe they worked up to making $14 an hour instead of $12 an hour, but they certainly weren't living that American dream. Then comes along the 2008 financial crisis, and I just saw it bring not only my family down to their knees, but tens of millions of Americans lost their homes, their jobs, and everything they had worked tirelessly for. And I was just sitting here scratching my head thinking, how could this thing we call the economy ruin so many lives? And that's when I began my study of economics, not because I was passionate about supply and demand, but because I cared about people, and I cared about people having quality livelihoods. And so that's really what brought me to studying the questions of the economy. And what set me forth on my book was, realizing that, hey, we live in the richest nation to have ever existed. If we distributed wealth equally, each of us would have more than $500,000 in our bank accounts. If we distributed income equally, each of us would have about $100,000 a year on top of that coming in every single year. Now, we wouldn't be living the Jeff Bezos life, but we'd all be doing pretty damn well. But of course, we know that's not the society we've built. That's not how we've chosen to organize it. So I wanted to better understand, how are we so rich, yet we still have 40 million Americans in poverty and another 100 million Americans a step away from poverty? And how are we so rich, but we can't solve our basic needs, like providing people with healthcare and education and housing? And what would it actually take to fix those societal problems? And by centering human beings rather than how do we increase this thing we call GDP, I think that the book takes a much more realistic and human approach to thinking about the economy than what most readers would typically expect from picking up an econ book.
And I guess this is the societal ails. You can boil it down to unfettered capitalism, right? I mean, I that is a way to simplify it to a degree. But what I love that your book does is you kind of incorporate some political theory into it when you're speaking about the nature of rights in this country. Our Bill of Rights is so focused on negative rights, which is a libertarian conception of rights. It's free. Think of it as freedom from something, right? And I remember studying this in school. And if you're a little bit more focused on providing for the general welfare of people, you're going to be focused on positive rights. Not freedom from something, but freedom to do something or to be able to live your life in a certain way. And you talk about this early on in your book, if you don't mind fleshing out that concept for people.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me because we all learn the history of America, and we learn that the Bill of Rights is core to who we are as a people. And that's true, but it's only part of the story. And what we fail to really develop in our middle school and high school education is realizing that the founders were far more complex thinkers than what we learn them to be. In fact, many of the early founders, people like Thomas Paine, Alexander Hamilton, argue not only for negative rights, but also these positive rights that we as members of society should be entitled to things like education, housing, employment opportunities, and the like, to be fully participating members of society. What's really interesting is that this was also a core demand of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, for example, fought tirelessly, of course, for the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Acts. But after those were passed, he pivoted his attention full time to focusing on economic rights. Why? Because for many of the founders, as for King, as for me, political rights, social rights, reproductive rights, for example, these crucial rights are in isolation insufficient to provide people with meaningful freedom to do and be what they have reason to value. That's the ultimate goal, to help people be able to live free lives where they can actually have real opportunity and choice in the type of life they build and structure. If they actually want to go become a teacher or go become a cook or whatever it might be, host a radio show perhaps, but we need these positive rights, and these positive rights is the state saying, we promise to give you these basic things to develop yourself as a full person. And the positive right we're most familiar with here in the United States is a K through 12 education. Every state has enshrined in its constitution that people have the right to an education. I grew up K through PhD in public schools, as a matter of fact. And that public school system that I didn't have to pay for is precisely what helped develop me, both as a voting citizen and as a member of our society, but also as a thinker and somebody that's then able to go out and write a book and think about how do we improve this society we live in. But when kids go to school, right, they don't have to go show a receipt that they paid to enter the door, right? They just have a right to enter that public school and to receive that education simply by living here in this, country. And so I think it's up to us to think about, what are the other rights necessary? We know that these political rights that we have aren't sufficient, right? What are the other rights necessary? And what I try to argue is that economic rights, such as the right to a job, the right to healthcare, the right to housing, which we can get into more detail later, are essential for us to fully realize our political rights. One of the political theorists who works on this, Isaiah Berlin, who kind of coined this conception of positive and negative freedom, talked about how to simply provide somebody with negative rights is to mock their condition. That if all you have is negative rights, the Bill of Rights is meaningless, essentially, if you're starving or if you're homeless. What good is that piece of paper to you if you can't meet your basic human needs?
Right. And it's the Bill of Rights being basically primarily concerned at that point with tyranny and things like that, ends up in a structure of what is guaranteed to us that is heavily individualist, and in a modern society and under capitalism, it's insufficient to provide people with their basic needs, as you laid out with those statistics, and just like with everybody's everyday reality. You mentioned MLK, and he was kind of playing with this concept before his assassination, as well as his opposition to the Vietnam War. I think that is key to kind of seeing where, why he was so unpopular at the time of his death as well, because these were the kind of things that were threatening to the establishment.
And I think that's so important to pick up on for a moment, because, look, challenging the vote was one thing, but that's not what got him assassinated. What got him assassinated was really standing up against the war and fighting for universal economic rights. Right. He wasn't just fighting for economic rights for Black America. He was building a cross-race, cross-class coalition to essentially challenge capitalism. He talked extensively about how we needed to abolish capitalism and build something new. And when you challenge capital, right, when you challenge the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks of the world, that's when shit hits the fan around here. And I think it's just such an important context for us to struggle with and think about, what we as Americans deserve. And we certainly deserve more than we're getting right now.
Certainly. And then, I think you may have mentioned, or I wrote it down, Thomas Paine is somebody who you borrow from and speak about his influence on this, as well as FDR, who before his death was moving towards a kind of more rebuilding phase of America as the war effort was winding down, and as the country had gotten through the worst of the Great Depression, it was what do we build next? And he was also talking about the concept of an economic bill of rights, of these positive rights being enshrined in legislation.
That's right. This idea of an economic bill of rights really does come from Roosevelt. And what I try to do in the book is kind of draw this linear history from, say, the founders to the radical Republicans and Lincoln, through Roosevelt and the New Deal, to, King in the civil rights movement, and then more recently, some of the progressive movements, the squad in the House at this moment, who are pushing for these economic rights. But Roosevelt's really the one who put this idea of an economic bill of rights on the map. It was actually in 1944, his second to last State of the Union address, where he called on Congress to enact an economic bill of rights to deliver full and meaningful freedom to the American people. What Roosevelt was searching for here was kind of the cherry on top of the New Deal, so to say. It was the most transformative part of the New Deal, where, in his words, we would actually enact cradle to grave security for all Americans. Now, let's not forget what World War II was actually about for Roosevelt. It was about his four freedoms. And one of those key four freedoms was the freedom for want. And how could he actually guarantee that to the American people? It was through this economic bill of rights. Unfortunately, when Roosevelt passed, Harry Truman at the time was his vice president, and Truman was far from anything we could call a progressive. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes Roosevelt made in his career, was to allow Truman on the ticket rather than to keep Henry Wallace, who was a staunch defender of economic rights, on the ticket, who I do think the future of the Democratic Party in this country would have been fundamentally different had that change not occurred. But unfortunately, that's what we had. So this idea didn't die with Roosevelt, though. It was really, kind of picked up by the civil rights movement. And that's something that we fail to talk about and fail to teach when we discuss the civil rights movement. In fact, even after King was assassinated, the idea continued on. It was his life partner and intellectual partner, Coretta Scott King, who continued to fight for these economic rights. And in fact, I know you all have talked about the Federal Reserve on the show before. The Federal Reserve's dual mandate actually comes out of the Economic Bill of Rights. The fact that the Federal Reserve has to pursue full employment was something won by the civil rights movement, won by Coretta Scott King, who was fighting for the right to a job.
That's funny, because that is not their literal stated intention at all anymore. No. I mean, we've covered statements made by past Fed chairs, by Larry Summers, right, about the level of unemployment that you can maintain in order to keep inflation down, is their theory, right? But full employment would be based on like Fed orthodoxy from the past few decades, or like since then in this neoliberal era, is that there has to be a certain level of unemployment to keep workers in line, and then secondarily, keep inflation down too. I mean, that has been seemingly abandoned by anybody, even on the Democratic side of things. Although I will say that Yellen is critical of that assertion, but doesn't go far enough, right? Like that is not anywhere in the discourse right now.
No, it's absolutely not. But this is a co-optation of this idea, quote unquote, that we call full employment, right? Full employment is in the Fed's mandate, but full employment doesn't mean, to me, 12 million Americans unemployed. It doesn't mean 4 or 5 or even 6% unemployment, which is how the Federal Reserve has modern day defined full employment. That's all BS. And this is the Federal Reserve saying, how do we get around this idea where we're supposed to provide full employment? Well, we come up with this new artificial concept called the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, that we push out and then say, 15 million Americans unemployed. Yes, that's full employment. If you ask me what full employment is, I'm going to give you the same response as I think most Americans would if you ask them. It means if somebody wants a job, they can get one. Right? That's full employment. And I don't think that's a radical concept. What's fascinating is we did polling on this, actually. And this isn't a left or right issue. Most Americans agree full employment means you can get a job if you want or need one. Full stop. It's not, we're not tinkering around with what the Federal Reserve calls R star and kind of coming up with all these artificial ways to claim we're at full employment, despite the fact that we're not. If we look at the labor market today, most economists are saying not that we're at full employment, they're saying we're beyond full employment. I mean, that's just a crazy idea to think about. How could we be beyond full employment? I mean, does that mean that most workers have 7 jobs? Like, no. I mean, it's true that some workers have 2 jobs, but it's because their wages are so low that they can't make ends meet.
Right, right. And the jobs guarantee, this is, I guess, kind of moving to part 2 of your book, where you lay out the your vision for an economic bill of rights, and the right to work is one of them. Explain to our audience what you think the planks would be of an economic bill of rights and what that means.
Sure. So, there's a number of planks that I lay out in the book, largely drawing on Roosevelt and then kind of updating it here for the 21st century. The most important one, and the one that I start with, is this idea of a right to a job. It's that any American willing and able to work should be able to access a job, but not any job, a job that is paid a meaningful and living wage. And so this would actually set a real floor in our labor market, right? If you think about it, the labor market today, a lot of people think we have a floor in the labor market because we have a minimum wage. But there's no minimum wage that applies to unemployed workers. They don't get to access that minimum wage. So a job guarantee would say that the government is willing and able to give anybody who wants a job one. This would radically change the labor market for so many reasons. Not only would it eradicate unemployment once and for all, it would also help eradicate poverty wages. I mean, in many states across the country, the minimum wage is still well south of $10 an hour. People cannot simply live on that. I don't even think anymore $15 an hour is sufficient, not with the other demands that we put on people, like rent, utilities, and healthcare costs and the like. So, this notion of a job guarantee, though, not only helps there, but it also really empowers workers in crucial ways. If you have a boss who is abusing you, verbally, sexually, etc., you actually have a real fallback position. You can actually leave and go get a job where you're not going to be harassed and mistreated. If you're a group of workers thinking about going on a strike, and all of a sudden, your firm says that they're going to close down your factory or your office building if you strike, and you're going to all be out of a job. Again, this is a type of institution that workers know that they will have a job opportunity waiting for them if something like that happens. So it really changes the scales of power. For listeners who might think, this is a little bit pie in the sky, I just want to throw out two pieces of information. One is the vast majority of Americans actually support this idea. Again, we did polling with Data for Progress and found that most Americans, in fact, over 80% of Americans, support the idea of a job guarantee, including most independents and Republicans as well. The second thing is that we've basically done it before. During the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration started something called the CWA, which was the predecessor of the WPA, which most listeners are probably familiar with, the Works Progress Administration. Within 2 months, they employed 1 in 10 workers. That's not 1 in 10 unemployed workers. They employed 1 in 10 of all American workers, putting them to work doing socially meaningful things, be that planting trees, constructing schools. In some instances, they had workers actually creating underwear for the winter, long underwear for the winter, because people were going to freeze to death if they didn't have proper clothing. So the government put them to work making clothing to then give away for free to low-income citizens. I challenge each and every one of us to walk around your community and think about, if we had actual workers, what could they do to improve our community? And there's going to be a long list of improvements. I know that for sure.
Yeah. And that is, it also plays into like the deep puritanical notions that we have in this country about the moral failings of people not working, right? So that undercuts that argument right on its face. You also talk about right to housing, right to an education, which you mentioned earlier, but then extending that, of course, through college, right to healthcare, single payer, right to basic income. So there's a UBI element too. I guess let's touch on that, because often when you hear about these thoughts, these ideas played around with by academics like yourself, I usually see it as either or, a jobs guarantee or a UBI, but you have both.
Yeah. So I think when people posit these things as either or, they have a failure of their imagination to think about how do we fundamentally restructure not the safety net of this country, because I think that's wrong, but the well-being state. That's what I like to call it. How do we actually restructure the well-being state to make sure that each and every one of us is taken care of? I think that's the world that we really want to be working towards. The job guarantee, I think, is crucial because, as I discussed earlier, it really rebalances the power dynamics of the labor market. But it also helps ensure people don't have these negative social stigmas of being unemployed. Welfare queens. This trope is precisely what helped dam the social safety net here in the United States in the first place. But we also need to recognize that many people engage in crucial work that's not market work, right? They might be engaged in care work, for example, or they might be engaged in creative work. I, for one, have an 18-month-old, and let me tell you, staying home with my 18-month-old is far harder than me coming into the office and answering some emails and advising some students and teaching a lecture class. Care work is often far harder, but we don't reward that in the market. And so we need these two things to go hand in hand. They actually complement each other, precisely because some people shouldn't be heading into work. Some people might choose to take care of a young one, a sick loved one, an elder family member. And to combine these two ideas together is what gives people the actual freedom. The opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to send my child to daycare and go to work. Or, hey, I would like to stay home with my child who is under 2 years old and help them develop and flourish and grow as a person. And I'm going to collect that basic income to help take care of us during that time. So it provides people with real choices. And I think that's what this is about. We have this, artificial notion that negative rights plus access to the market gives us choice. But really, it's just simply not the case. I mean, most people have essentially no choice over what they do in their daily lives.
So I guess this is a perfect way to kind of wrap up here and talk about that notion of what freedom really means, because libertarians have a monopoly on the frickin' word, it seems like, in the way that they like to manipulate it, or even libertarian or neoliberal concepts of what freedom really means, and what when you don't have economic freedom, you really don't have the freedom to do anything. And so that's kind of where we got to start, right?
Absolutely. I think reclaiming this idea of freedom is key. It's, as you highlighted, it's an idea owned by the right today. But one thing I just want to point out is that, the current system we have fails to deliver negative freedom, right? Even according to their own definition. Let's say we buy their definition, which I don't think we should. But if we buy it, their own society they've built, this neoliberal hellscape that we find ourselves in, doesn't deliver meaningful negative freedom either. Most of us spend most of our waking hours at the workplace. Workplaces are essentially mini dictatorships. We don't have freedom in the workplace, right? We are told what to do, when to do it by our bosses. That's why we have bosses. Elizabeth Anderson's work on this is just excellent. She calls it private government. And so most of us are spending, our time and receiving our wages based on what our mini dictators, our bosses, say we deserve and decide what we do with our time. So even accepting that, I think we're failing. But I don't think we should. I think we need to work on building a richer, more meaningful idea of freedom. I think this is one reason why people are so up in arms over the current presidential election, for example. President Trump is a dire threat to democracy. Democracy is a cornerstone of freedom. I do believe that. But I also don't think, again, that it's sufficient for our vote to matter, for us to even have time to go to the polls, right? How many workers don't have time to go to the polls because that's not a national holiday in America, because their boss, again, withholding their freedom, says, no, you can't take time off of work to vote. We need to challenge this concept and reclaim it to be a more inclusive idea that actually provides us with real opportunities and choices to define the lives that we, our loved ones, and our communities collectively lead.
Well, Mark Paul, we have someone writing in. Bayer N Man 12 says, "Please make Mark Paul dictator for a day." I don't know. I don't know if you're gonna if you're working on that at all, but I concur. I appreciate it. Dr. Mark Paul, assistant professor of economics at Rutgers, author of The Ends of Freedom: Recovering America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights. We will put a link to your book wherever people are listening or watching this, and at our website majority.fm. Thanks so much, Mark. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.